Good evening, I'm Marissa Semkiw in for Michael Corin. A Sun News exclusive reports revealed that since the new federal prostitution laws came into effect 2 months ago, no Johns have been charged in Ontario. Recall, Bill C-36, which is the Tories' Prostitution Act, criminalized the purchase of sex, targeting the Johns and the pimps. So given that the new law states that our police forces should be going after the Johns, why has not one been charged in Ontario? A few reasons. Remember, when the court previously struck down 3 provisions of Canada's prostitution laws, they opened the door for Parliament to legislate. They never prescribed what Parliament could do. They just said what they could not legislate. So, Parliament introduced new laws, and recall at the time opposition parties and members of the media relentless in questioning the constitutionality of the bill. They said send it to the Supreme Court. Why? Because as NDP MP François Boivin said, life is short and she hates to waste her time. But of course, Parliament doesn't need the court's permission to pass laws, so the law passed. What happened next? Kathleen Wynne, Ontario's premier, who curiously was silent during the committee hearings, comes out after the fact and declares that she has, quote, grave concerns about the constitutionality of the bill. In a statement, Wynne asked her Attorney General, Madeleine Meilleur, to advise me on the constitutional validity of this legislation and our options as a government in the event that the legislation's constitutionality is in question. In effect, what Wynne has done is she sent a strong signal that has no effect in law, but that police need to heed. They can choose to ignore, but what is the incentive if there is a chance that the AG could come back and say that the law is unconstitutional, and therefore we won't be prosecuting the Johns? So what is the incentive to lay all kinds of charges, use their time and money and resources only to be thrown out? What's worse is that Johns could later sue for abuse of power. What is the impetus to enforce it? So that we've seen no Johns charged could be because Kathleen Wynne is arbitrarily deciding she doesn't like the law. Or, perhaps, because our chiefs of police don't care, because it's not an important policing initiative. Anecdotally, in speaking to friends that are officers in Toronto, they haven't seen a John sweep in years, let alone in the last 2 months. They also say that when John sweeps are done, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. They were told of the laws, and then they were told business as usual. Are our chiefs of police arbitrarily deciding what laws to enforce and what laws not to? I sure hope not, because that would open the door to a very serious abuse of power. Now, we've contacted Toronto Police to ask how they're enforcing the law. In an email, they responded saying this: "We are not commenting on the new prostitution laws." Why not? Have they been told to not enforce the law? We don't know. But what is clear is that they haven't been told to enforce the law. Police chiefs have full autonomy to run investigations, and they haven't. The question is, why?
The law is being enforced. It's, of course, it's to the police to lay charge, and we're not directing the police how to do their work. So, the law has been passed, and we are applying the new law.
Joining us now for further discussion on the Ontario's selective enforcement of the law is criminal defense lawyer Ed Preachy. Ed, that was Ontario's Attorney General. She says the laws are being enforced. Doesn't sound like it.
Well, the law's in place. I'm sure that the position of the provincial government and, frankly, the police services across Ontario is that the law is there. And if somebody is visibly seen violating the law, they're going to either be cautioned or charged, as anybody else would be with other charges. Well,
I mean, you walk down the streets at midnight and you can see enough Johns driving in their black cars with tinted windows. I think it's quite clear that they're there.
Well, I mean, bear in mind that what everybody knows is going on isn't sufficient from a police investigatory standpoint. So the police can't do what you and I might do, which is just know that an area is sort of renowned for a certain activity and, as they say, shoot fish in a barrel. If they want to be involved in that, they're going to have to send officers there. They're going to have to conduct an undercover investigation. They're going to have to gather the evidence.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that they can't do it. It's a question of saying, should they be doing it? Is that a top priority for policing? It's not for the government, in my view, to be directing police and telling them, here's where your priorities ought to be. Here's where your resources need to be.
Should they be is not the question. That is the law. The law is that the purchase of sex is now criminal. Do police not have an obligation to uphold the law?
Police have the same restrictions that everybody else does in terms of the utilization of their budget and the priorities. They know what the laws are. They're charged with enforcing those laws. And what they do is they make a selective determination. It's not an arbitrary one, in my view, as you suggested in the monologue. It's one that's calculated on the basis of where are we doing the most help, where is the most danger, where are the most complaints. So I have little doubt that if, for example, a community comes together and says, you know what, there's a major prostitution problem in our neighborhood. We think Johns are coming in and out towards schools, or they're near houses, or it's affecting a business improvement area, things along those lines, police will be forced ultimately to respond. If you're asking why aren't police out there each and every night at a particular street corner rounding up the Johns, I suspect it's because hopefully they're in our neighborhood stopping people from breaking into our homes or dealing drugs.
You are implying that Johns do not pose a threat, a severe enough threat to warrant putting our resources there. Part of the reason these laws were created is because it was recognized on the part of the Conservative government that inherent in prostitution is violence, drug abuse, exploitation of women. Johns perpetrate those crimes. So how are you tackling those crimes if you're not going after them?
Some Johns perpetrate those crimes, okay? The reality is some Johns do.
And how are you supposed to know which Johns do and which Johns don't if you don't go after them?
When people make a complaint, if a prostitute comes forward and says, I was sexually assaulted, or if an individual comes forward and says, look, I can tell you there are prostitutes who are underage involved here and Johns are hiring them. Police will act on that intelligence. They'll act on those approaches. If you're asking why aren't police going after the run-of-the-mill everyday John, I don't know whether they've been directed to do that. I don't suspect a grand conspiracy about that.
That's the problem, is they haven't been directed to do that.
But they don't need to be directed to do that. It's not their place. The police will make a determination about where's the appropriate place to spend their money and to allocate their resources. The reality is, if people aren't making a complaint, the prosecution of Johns per se, not ones who are involved in sexual assault, who are involved in drug trafficking, who are involved in human trafficking, or the use of prostitutes who are underage. All of those are elements that are far more serious, and I can assure you, I strongly suspect the police are not looking the other way. But when it comes to setting up sting operations at street corners to get the run-of-the-mill John, I think police, frankly, are no more interested in that than they are setting up sting operations at Shoppers Drug Mart to take down shoplifters. It's just not a police priority.
What do you make of Kathleen Wynne's comments questioning the constitutionality of the law and sending the bill to the AG, who can then come out with her decision saying, I believe the law is unconstitutional, therefore we're not going to enforce it, we're not going to prosecute. Do you think that police are indirectly receiving a message that basically says, well, if we go ahead and we charge these guys, it is likely that those charges will essentially be thrown out in court? Do you think that is affecting their calculation?
I'll say this. The Premier's comments in her direction to the Attorney General, I think, is one that is indicative of the larger sort of disconnect that we have between the fact that the federal government makes laws, but it's the provincial governments ultimately that pay the price to enforce them, because our courts and our police services are ultimately paid for out of provincial budgets, and it's the feds that decide what's criminal and what isn't. So when you have this disconnect, and the Premier clearly seems to be offside or not on the same page as the feds are on this point, so she wants to bring the case forward to have the unconstitutionality determined. Does that send a message to the police forces themselves? I don't know that they're taking a clear message from that, but I think it is fair to say that police will look at this, and when they come to their prioritization calculation, they may say, if the constitutionality is in question, why are we allocating resources? But as your own monologue pointed out, and as the stats indicate, it's not like police were enforcing prostitution laws before the change in the legislation. Frankly, this was never a high priority item. It hasn't been a high priority item for decades.
And that's a problem. And I'm glad you bring that up. We have a graphic that I want to show you. These are the total number of prostitution charges in Ontario, starting from 2005, going straight until 2013. You can see there that in 2005, there were 1,200, just over 1,200 persons charged for prostitution-related offenses. By 2013, that drops to 242. Is that because the industry is getting smaller, or because police aren't enforcing it?
No, I mean, that's clearly
a concerning trend.
I don't know if it's a concerning trend. I think the trend is what it is. And it is police-based. I don't think that's because the prostitution trade has shrunk. I'm not naive enough to say that. And I can tell you anecdotally in my own practice, when I started practicing 15 years ago, I had quite a number of clients who were coming to me with prostitution-related offenses. Today, frankly, the answer is zero. Nobody does. So very few people are being prosecuted. That is a decision ultimately by police, I suspect. But the question is whether that decision is right or wrong. At the end of the day, police are spending a lot more time online prosecuting child pornography cases. They're spending a lot more time, hopefully, in our communities looking after break-and-enters. They're spending a lot more time prosecuting terrorism offenses. That's where I want our money to go.
But you are arbitrarily deciding that break and enter cases.
Arbitrarily.
Yes, it is. It is arbitrarily deciding that break and enter cases pose more of a threat than Johns do to prostitutes.
Well, I don't think that's arbitrary. It's not like police are going through the criminal code and throwing a dart at it and saying, "We'll prosecute this offense, but not another offense." I think, and they're not going to say this because they're too savvy to it, but I suspect that what police are doing is saying, "Look, the reality is the harm to the community, the damage within our community is very limited from the perspective of prostitution. We understand that Johns can be involved in some serious harm. When those allegations are made, we'll go after those Johns on a case-by-case basis." So a prostitute that comes forward and says, "A John has been abusing me," or "A pimp is abusing me," they're going to go after those people. But if you're asking for police to sit out in cars night after night with surveillance cameras, which is the kind of work that's required.
I don't think it would be night after night, and I don't also buy the excuse that they don't have resources. They can reallocate resources to this because this is the law.
Where are they taking it from, Marissa?
Ed, you are a criminal defense lawyer. Above all, you believe in fidelity to the law, and the police service is arbitrarily choosing not to uphold that law.
Again, it's
They're
not
enforcing
arbitrary,
it.
and while I may be a lawyer, I'm a human being and a member of society first. Okay, I look at what the police forces are tasked with, and I'm often a critic of police forces, as you know, often on this show. What I'm saying is that when I look at police, say, you know what, I've got X dollars in my budget, and I've got a drug problem in this neighborhood, I've got a terrorism problem in that neighborhood, I've got a child pornography problem that if I tasked every single officer in my force 24/7, 365 would never end. I'm not looking at Johns. Frankly, I'm not looking at Johns unless the community calls me up and says, this is a problem. And if that's the case, I'll task a few officers, I'll put them there for a few nights, and I'll hope it'll go away. But I know as a chief of police, that's only going to stem the problem for 2 or 3 weeks.
All right, Ed. Well, I'm not putting any blame on anyone. I'm just throwing the question out there to our viewers. I do want to know what they think, so please let me know. Ed, thank you for your time.
Thank you.